we're going down a deep dive into what I think is a modern problem. In fact, we know it's a modern problem because there's data on it. So we're going to talk about race day anxiety, how to confront it, run with it, and potentially overcome it. And I think this is such a relevant topic, something that we've gotten from high school coaches, college coaches, and goes beyond coaching. If you look at books like Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, is we have an anxiety problem overall with young kids, young adults, teens, etc. There's all sorts of data on it. And guess what? When you're generally anxious, when anxiety is elevated, that makes performance anxiety worse.
Yeah.
It's like your alarm is trained to be trigger happy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're dealing with. And I've heard it from so many coaches. I know you've experienced it, and I've gotten so many emails from parents saying, hey, my high school kid is dealing with anxiety. What do you suggest they do for race day? And it's getting in the way of people performing to their potential. So we're gonna unpack it all.
And I think it's important to call out too with anxiety and race day anxiety that it's multidimensional, right? It exists on a spectrum. And so the first thing we have to do is figure out where on the spectrum of anxiety someone is experiencing and expressing as within the coach-athlete relationship in relative to race day, but also too relative to maybe just their daily rhythm and daily life, because that has an impact as well. And that's what makes it so tricky, just throwing everything in this big anxiety pool and bucket and saying, all right, great. And there's a shallow end of anxiety and there's a deep end. And there's a lot in between. I think first, Steve, let's talk about markers or ways to identify whether we're interacting with someone who might be in the shallow end of anxiety or who's going to be off in the deep end.
This is such an important point because I think we've got to know where our expertise is, right? And as coaches, we are not trained mental health professionals.
Definitely not.
We can help people navigate within the narrow realm of racing and performance anxiety a little bit. But if it is a systemic problem, and if it is a global issue, if they are, as you said, in the deep end, then we need to punt, right? We need to get a professional who knows what they're doing and has the education and background to be able to use interventions that will help attack the issue and diagnose the issue. So I think a couple things I look at when I was coaching in deciding this, do I handle it or do I punt, is first off, I had experts who I would consult. So I'd have mental health professionals who were friends, colleagues, sports psychologists, social workers who were trained with dealing with this stuff in their professional realm. And I think that really helped me as navigating this, because if I was ever on the fence, I'd just send an email, call, and say, hey, I've got a kid. Here's what they're going through. What do you think? And sometimes they'd be like, yeah, it sounds more performance orientated. I think you can give them the tools, blah, blah, blah. Other times they'd be like, yeah, refer them out. We need extra help there. So I think if you can have friends, colleagues, etc., who you're able to bounce ideas off, just like we would as coaches, where I call John up and say, hey, I've got a kid who's struggling with threshold runs or peaking or biomechanics. What do you think here? You call in the experts and you get an idea so that you can understand how to deal with it. So I think having and developing those resources is key. B, what I tend to look at is compare their day-to-day, what I see at practice, what do I see when they show up, what do I see when we're shooting the shit in my office when I was coaching college, right? What do I see on trips when we're just hanging out, when we're eating dinner, versus what do I see on race day? And I think that delineation is really important and really key, because if there's signs or symptoms of chronic, everyday anxiety around living, then I know that you know what? This is a call in the expert situation because this isn't just occurring in this narrow field. Now, I should say it's not just as narrow. Again, John, you contextualize it. There's a shallow and a deep end and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's not just on race day. Sometimes it's during the big workout that everybody gets excited for. Some people get a little scared or anxious for it because they know, oh, I'm trying to prove myself, or they think of it. So they treat it more like race day. Again, that's a little bit more than just anxiety pre-race, but it still falls in that realm as long as it doesn't exude everywhere else. It falls in that realm. And then the last thing I'll say before turning it over is I look for patterns and signs and symptoms within the athlete and how they handle things, right? Do they, when we're in big groups, do they avoid always? Do they look for ways to cope in a avoidant or a negative direction outside of sport? I look for those patterns and behaviors, and if I start seeing them more and more, then I know that, again, it's generalized and not specific, which is what we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, I appreciate that lens, Steve. Yeah, it's especially reaching out to practitioners who are more in the mental health space is really key. And I think isn't necessarily what motivated anyone to get into coaching, but it's a reality with the modern athlete that we have to be sensitive to and have strategies and also have professionals at our disposal to call upon. And that's the difficulty with being the modern coach, right? Is it's a lot more contextual and complex than it might have been 10, 20, even 30 years ago. So we have to have essentially more tools in the toolbox. And this is now one of them that we can't not have in this day and age. And for me, the lens that I look through anxiety and how someone's expressing or how their relationship with it really anchors on a simple definition. And it's what is their level of perceived threat, right? Because anxiety is related to threat. So you have the shallow end, or the feeling of uneasiness, nervousness, worry. Hey, I want to do well. I want to PR. I want to win this race. I want to qualify. That's like the shallow end, and that's a normal, I wouldn't say normal, but more like typical, like present task-specific anxiety that is related to the practicalities of race day. Because again, races are unknown. The outcome's unknown. We know the distance. We know, say, cross country or road racing or marathon, we might know the course or the track, but there's also that degree of unknown. And that's okay to have that sense of nervousness or worry about, hey, I want to do well on race day, or like you said, Steve, that big workout day, right? Because again, we're testing our limits. We're trying to figure out where we're at versus the mental condition of anxiety, when you do need to call, in my opinion, qualified mental health professional, is when you have this pattern of excessive apprehension, excessive perception of real or perceived threats that leads to these avoidance behaviors, right? Saying, oh yeah, I disengage, or I just start jogging it in, or oh, like I forgot my shoe and I can't race, whoopsie. And it's like, those things might happen, but are they happening not only on race day, but on any type of day where there's like some type of standard of performance put upon that person? And again, sport is designed in our modern era to teach us a lot of things, especially with young people and even aging people. Like, it's a vehicle of exploration and a vehicle of discovery and a vehicle of learning about who we are and how we relate to the world around us. But when you start to see this like excessive, consistent, habitual perception of threats, and it's always this high threat state, like 5-alarm fire, oh my gosh, it's wild and crazy. That's when, like, all right, we need to outsource it, and as you say, Steve, punt to someone else. Because again, in this day and age, we have this overabundance of threat being thrusted upon people through their media consumption. Like, it's one of the biggest ways to, like, experiments I always do with people on anxiety, say, hey, go off Instagram for a month. Like, just don't engage on social media for a month, a whole month. Like, and the world will continue to spin You'll continue to, the sun will go up and go down. Like, you'll continue to breathe. And you know what? You'll probably feel better, because that thing is a total black hole that festers this perceived level of threat and fear. And with that, it creates this sense of paralysis that can express as anxiety.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think there are simple things that we can suggest as a coach that can help in that regard. And there's all sorts of data, as we've mentioned, that shows that social media can cause and contribute enormously to this generalized anxiety around things, which can make us trigger happy again in terms of anxiety, or alarm trigger happy in terms of anxiety around performance as well. I think one of the actually on that, one of my favorite studies, in a sad way, but it gets at this, is some researchers after the Boston Marathon bombing that we're all familiar with years ago. They tracked the stress and anxiety levels of people who were there on that day or had friends or family like literally right there and affected. So people who experienced the thing, essentially, versus people who were out of the state, out of Massachusetts, and simply watched or consumed online content about it. And they tracked their stress and anxiety levels. Those who during the day or two that were main of the Boston Marathon bombing and then the hunt for the guy afterwards, those who consumed over 6 hours of either TV, social media, Reddit, online coverage, 6 hours plus, had higher stress and anxiety levels than those who were literally there.
Wow.
And what that gets at, again, is you got to remember our brain is just this blob in our head, and it's perceiving the world based on the information it gets. And if you're consuming 6, 7, 8, 9 hours telling you, holy crap, this threat, as you eloquently put it, this threat is real, it's here, I'm consumed by it, your brain's going to go, okay, we hear you, we see you, there's a threat. Up the stress and anxiety, because it doesn't realize that threat isn't the tiger in the jungle or on the savannah in front of us, right? That's how it interprets it. It says, oh, this must be the threat. In many ways, and there's data behind us, social media, getting on Instagram is the same thing, right? You feel insignificant, you feel lost, you feel like you don't compare up against others, right? You feel slow, not attractive, whatever it is, right? This thing is telling us constantly, threat, you're not good enough. And eventually our brain goes, yeah, you're right, we're not. Like, we're under threat. And our body, stress hormones, cortisol, etc., does its thing because that's what it feels. So I think, yes, professionals, etc., but often one of the first steps when you're dealing with people is like, how do we turn down that threat alarm? And from a generalized standpoint, there are simple things like getting off Instagram. We saw it with the Olympics. I think it was the on 1500 runner, Ollie Hoare, who mentioned being on social media during the Olympics kind of put a damper on his racing. Like, he felt stressed because of it. And you saw this often. And this is why people, again, are often told, going to the Olympics, shut it all down, turn it all off. Because we know that even if we think we're using it responsibly, it just hijacks our brain a little bit and makes us feel stressed and anxious. So again, simple things. Limit your social media. Limit that comparison. Watch your kind of news consumption if you're older. Teens, maybe not so much, but watch your news consumption if you're older. There's data going back to the 1970s from a researcher scientist called George Gerbner, which coined mean world syndrome, which he basically found that the more news people watched, the more they thought the world was violent, threatening, and dangerous, because if it bleeds, it leads. Again, the information coming in, our brain says, oh, we've watched a lot of murders on the news. This must be the world we're living in. So minimizing those consumptions as best you can and doing real things in the real world that make you realize, the world's not as dangerous. Like, I'm secure. I'm I'm okay. And the last thing I'll mention on this is, I think you touched on it, but I think it's so important, is that the modern coach is different, right? This
Mm-hmm.
isn't the coach that even we grew up with. Like, you are the first line of defense. You're the person they trust. I would tell recruits all the time, your kid is going to spend more time around me than any other adult through these 4 or 5 years of college, right? And you start to have that trust, relationship, bonding. And any college coach will tell you that you'll have athletes show up with mental health disorders, with thoughts of suicide. You'll have them show up and admit to eating disorders, all sorts of actual severe mental health problems. And you're often the first person they feel comfortable telling this to, even though you're not trained necessarily to handle it. But that trust and that relationship is built there. And unfortunately, in a modern world, it's often not built there with many other adults. So we've got to figure out how to, again, we got to know our expertise, but we've also got to be there to help guide and nurture people into the right treatments, therapies, or even tools, such as taking away social media, shifting their emphasis in life, etc., that can help them manage this stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Perception is selection. And it's such a simple term, but such a powerful term, because everything you documented there, Steve, with all the different types of orientations based off your media consumption, whether it be TV and news, social media, etc., right? That shapes the world you perceive. And the selection part is really important. We have, again, this is a modern problem because it is so accelerated now with the advent of social media and the digital landscape that everyone's a native to and lives in, that is sometimes coupled with or in partnership or even in place of actual reality, right? This push, this thrust to get people to be more digital in their lives, right? Whether it be AI, the simulation, blah, 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 virtual reality, all that type of stuff. Think back to Henry Thoreau, who was like, hey, yeah, I'm just going to go live in the woods by myself for 2 years because it's way too much stimulus for me in Concord, Massachusetts in the 1800s. And I've been to Concord, Massachusetts many a times in this day and age. It's a pretty chill place. Like, that's the thing, is reminding people who have anxiety is that perception is selection. And then two, the other thing I've noticed recently with the modern youth or young athlete is their interpretation of conflict as threat. And that's a really interesting thing, right? Because one thing sport and the interpersonal relationship dynamics in sport is supposed to teach us is how to cope with conflict and find resolution, because there's always going to be conflict in human relationships and interactions. There's going to be internal conflict with, like, yourself. Hey, I want to do well in this race or this workout, or maybe with a team member, or maybe between a coach and an athlete, or what have you. But we now fast track to conflict being a threat. And this is bad, and this person's a demon, and they confronted me with this call out on maybe a less than palatable behavior or comment I had, and now this person sucks. And so we go to cancel them or demonize people so quickly now. It's phenomenal. Versus one thing I think we have to remember is we have to give people grace and second chances, and know that a death penalty in terms of kicking someone off the team or calling someone this or that, like, that's like really serious abuses, which are zero tolerance. Conflict, there should be tolerance for conflict in this day and age. And that's what racing is designed to teach us, is a healthy way to cope with internal conflict with an external demand that is time specific and also unknown. And so we have to, again, come back to that as well and understand we have to be ready to reevaluate or reorient someone's perception that might be excessively on the threat side and say, hey, look, I don't know if this is a threat to your safety, health, or well-being. It just might be a conflict, and we have to find a resolution to it.
It's a couple things come to mind, John, is that, again, the way I like to see it is we've made that threat alarm hyper responsive.
Yeah.
So things that should be a conflict you just solve and come together and blah 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 become feel like an existential crisis, right? And part of that is, again, the environment we grow up in, but there's some wonderful data that has come out recently that has shown that sport plays a really big part in helping us see this difference. And we've done a really shitty job of creating spaces for that to happen.
Right.
No, I'm serious. There was some wonderful research by Peter Gray and some colleagues that found that one of the key places that kids growing up learn about this kind of distinction between conflict that we can solve and existential threats is during play.
Yeah.
And what the research shows is that kids going out and playing kickball or football or baseball or whatever at PE or after school without too much adult intervention learned how to solve disputes. They learned how to solve conflicts. They learned how to go back and forth. And I'm sure you probably remember this as well as a kid.
Oh, shit. Yeah, dude. On the basketball playground after school, like we're playing, there's no ref. And we're like, hey, that's a foul. No, that's not a foul. Yes, that's a foul. And it's like you go back and forth and then finally you figure out if it's a foul or not. And then you keep playing the game. But the goal is to keep playing the game.
Exactly. That's it. That's 100% it. In research shows, not surprisingly, this is a key developmental period and thing that we learn. But what happens now is more than ever is that more of those activities are organized and regulated by adults. And what the research shows is if there is an adult standing there to be that ref, we don't learn. Because what do? Whenever that conflict and you say, oh, foul, he hit me, you don't solve that conflict, so you keep playing. You turn to the ref. You avoid the confrontation and learn to avoid by going to the ref, the adult, to solve it. And again, what this research shows is that we don't develop those skill sets over time that allow us to see, hey, this is something that we're going to be okay and that we can solve it. Like we punt. Or in the modern generation, I think, and I experienced this as a college coach as well, is this the older iteration of this is that there's a little conflict on your team and on your college team, and instead of addressing, solving, talking about it, you get a call from mom or dad. Right? That's the modern iteration of this is the ref. I'm going to go to the ref, even though I'm an 18, 19, 20-year-old adult. Because what is that? It's an avoidant behavior.
Yeah.
It's that alarm. This conflict feels like existential threat. So I've got to punt instead of figure it out. And that contributes, again, we have research on this. This contributes to this overwhelming kind of feeling of anxiety and stress because we haven't given the space or the environment to develop these tools that we should.
And that's a key part about the modern athlete related to social media consumption that I want to piggyback on, Steve, is this idea of perfectionism, right? And it's this unrealistic filter. A lot of what you see visually on social media is AI generated, enhanced, filtered, right? It's not legitimate, real reality. And so what happens though is if you are brought up from a developmental space with this idea that perfect is the only option, and if you're not perfect, you're demonized, you're bad, you get no second chances, right? That's fundamentally at conflict with the human condition. We are imperfect individuals, I myself included, right? Like, it doesn't matter. People have bad days. They might make a comment that's not like the most sensitive comment in the world, right? Like, we can't expect people to always be at this level of perfect relational capacity, because that is what learning is about: fumbles, missteps, faults, and errors. But learning with a behavior correction, learning and using that miscue, that misstep, that dead end as a way to say, okay, hey, I need to make an adjustment. Now what's happening, right, is people aren't giving each other that space to make that adjustment. And so on race day, when we get back to this reality, we have to understand, coming into this sphere, People might not have the mental coping or developmental strategies that they might have had 5, 10, 20 years ago. And so as the modern coach, we have to be a little bit more sensitive to, all right, what is really the goal, mental and emotional outcome of this endeavor for this person, where they are and where they could be, and also to where they want to go. And I think that's also the key, right, as a coach, is understanding it's not about where I want them to go and where I think they could be. I can encourage that. I can support that. I can say, hey, look, you can think about scaling up to this mountain peak. I think it's in you. But fundamentally, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So it's like also getting that understanding about where they want to go from where they are, and then supporting that journey of them as well in the best way you can from your seat as a coach.
Yeah, I love how you put that. The way I see it, again, I've got a little over 1-year-old daughter, and what I've found fascinating is that as a parent, I can either create like the secure place where she can go explore, or I can create like she's anxiously attached to me. Meaning, like, she doesn't, if we go somewhere new, she doesn't want to leave my side. She wants to hold my hand. She wants to be attached. She doesn't want to explore off of it. Or she learns that, hey, dad or mom are standing there. I can go wander around, the playground or whatever it is, wherever the area. And a lot of that is like how I respond to things, right? If after she tumbles and falls, I run over there and, oh my God, are you okay? Are you okay? She'll start crying because she learns like, oh, I must be in trouble, right? I should cry. If it's like a simple fall, a trip or whatever, and she catches herself, she'll look at me, and if you're just like, you're good, keep going, she'll brush it off and keep going, because she looks to like the adults who she trusts in life to understand, am I all right? Am I not? Is this something I should be scared of? Or what have you? Because she doesn't know what's going on in the world. And I think often, if you bear with me with this analogy, I think coaches play the same role, right? Am I okay to take risks? Am I okay to explore this path? What direction am I headed in? As you said, you can't force the direction, but what you can do is be like the parent there and be like, yeah, it's okay. Go explore. If you fall, if you fail, life's not going to be over. I'm not going to hate you, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to ignore you. We're going to figure out how to get better if you take these chances and shots. And I think more and more in a world that kind of pushes us towards fear, anxiety, threat, and avoidance, it's our job as coaches to figure out how do we be that base where it says, no, like, we want you to explore, we want you to try things, we want you to take risks, we want you to take chances, we want to see how good you can be. And if you fall short, like, we're gonna attack it head on no matter what. We're not gonna sit here and boohoo and cry in terms of seeing this as like a threat. It's an opportunity, and I think that's a fundamental part of being a modern coach.
Yeah, I agree. I think what also makes it so hard, Steve, is like we talked about earlier, is the multidimensional capacity in which anxiety can express in different people. And essentially, right, what we want to do in relation to the performance context, in relation to the coach-athlete experience and relationship, in relation to race day, what have you, is we want to find a way to de-escalate as best we can and help that athlete de-escalate that anxiety. And everyone's going to be different, right? Because there's people who have anxiety that's the positive, like, ear stress, like the good stress. Hey, I want to do really well and I want to win this race or get top 3 and qualify to state, qualify to here, get this mark. And so I'm really focused in on that, and I'm going to will myself to do that. And those are awesome examples of where like it's positive nerves, where it's like the good nerves, right? I'm preparing for battle type situation. And maybe it's just a reinforcement of, hey, trust your training. You're really well prepared. Look at all the double runs you've done. Look at all the morning runs you've done. Look at the track workouts you've done. Look at your all this, blah, 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 blah. Or if they're coming from a space of being injured, reminding them of, hey, you're really strong. You're coming back off this injury like you're in the best shape of your life. Whatever it needs to be that you can point to that is concrete to give that person confidence, to maybe have them zone in to keep that race day stress useful and positive and as a pinpointed flame that will burn bright, versus it being a randomized fire that's going to burn the house down. Now, when you flip that onto the burn the house down anxiety that someone has, is so worried about the outcome, so worried about what time or place they're going to get, that's crippling. That is then maybe a different orientation of saying, hey, so much focused on the outcome, we're focused on the process. We want to take risks. We want to see you take strategic risks here and learn from it. Not say, hey, did or didn't you do that? And if you aren't in this place or don't hit this split, it's exile for you, and it's the prison of judgment for you. It's a, hey, what do you learn from it situation to help you grow and become better? So that's an important thing to understand when we characterize this for each individual, and then giving them coping and de-escalation strategies on the day.
Yeah, exactly. I'd summarize it by saying, like, where's the threat coming from?
Right.
And that threat can come from different places, right? So if it's outcome dominated, where they're just obsessed over this, how I do, the time I get, the place I get defines who I am as a person, then you've got to figure out ways how to shift that orientation. As you said, how do we focus on the process? How do I give them something else besides that outcome to shift their attention to? How do I redefine success, right? I remember an athlete I was working with once who was, again, in this kind of arena. We redefined success for races. We said, you know what? I don't care about anything but how you get out. If you put yourself in the top pack, we're going to consider that a win for today. For others, you reframe it and you say, I don't care I just want the last mile of this 5-mile cross country or 8K cross country race. I want this one to be your best one, right? We're going to focus on executing that last bit. Again, you're shifting that orientation and redefining success and away from just the total outcome that gives them a little bit more of control. Others, maybe it's not that outcome. Maybe it's coming from, and I've seen this way too many times, maybe it's coming from like parents. They feel they're going to let down their parents, or they have one of their parents who is, thinks they're the coach and over coaches their child and puts fear of failure on them, et cetera, et cetera. And you've got to, again, shift their orientation, get them to realize that, hey, win or lose, your mom or dad's gonna still love you. And if they come after you and critique you, like, I'll help act as a buffer during that, right? Mm-hmm. We'll navigate this together. You're not running. Are you running for your parents? Or are you running for yourself? You're reorientating their motivation style. And I think step one is, as you said, is like figuring out what kind of anxiety it is in terms of performance and where the kind of source is, so that you can use strategies as a coach to reframe, reorient, and refocus on things that aren't saying, hey, threat.
And this is what makes it so hard, right? Is we have a classroom as coaches, whether it be individual, whether you're working like online or remotely, one-on-one with someone, or within kind of a more of a traditional team-based setting in this classic environment or club environment, where you have a cornucopia and a wide spectrum of ability levels. And versus, say, the calculus teacher in high school is only teaching students who have gone through all the prerequisites and now who understand calculus at a very high level and who are furthering that depth of understanding about that subject matter, right? But you might have signed up and said, hey, yeah, I want to be an AP calculus teacher, but you have in your classroom someone who hasn't passed trigonometry or pre-algebra, right? They're going to have a difficult time understanding the material and curriculum, but at the same token, too, you can't always backslide in the dynamic of the entire setting to the skill set or ability level of kind of that introductory performer, introductory athlete, because you also have advanced people in your classroom as well on the team. So everyone's a little bit different in that regard. But ultimately, right, one thing that we know that is a continual positive antidote for anxiety is demonstrated progress towards something, right? This is why high school works, college works. This is why all these things work. So you have progress towards degree, right? You go through this grade and then this grade. This is why companies and businesses are set up with getting promotions and moving up the ladder, so to speak. And this is why people fall into midlife crises when they stop having progress towards something. Once they got the house, the picket fence, the kids, and all those types of things, they realize, okay, what am I progressing towards? And this is a really important anchor for stability in the human psyche, is this concept of progress. And when we don't have that, or when it is taken from us, or where we feel futile and we have all these threats, and these threats are going to compromise our progress towards something, that's when we start to shut off or shut down, right? So as a coach, it's really important, whether it be through training, whether it be through the context of a series of races in a row, that you highlight what the learning progression is, and so that they can demonstrate this like exploration and this ability to take risks, but also then too this ability to try it again and demonstrate improved competency, so that it reinforces this idea like, hey, yeah, I am getting better. Hey, yeah, I can do this. Hey, yeah, like this is exciting. This is fun. I get to try something. I get to not fail it. I get to basically fail at it. I get to engineer a better way to do it, and then I get to overcome it and improve. This is really engrossing, and I feel excited about this journey versus, oh my gosh, if I don't run this pace, the world's going to end. Or I don't get this place, or I don't run this time, that my world's going to end.
It's pretty simple. When we don't have hope, when we don't see a future, we give up.
Yeah,
like that's what happens.
Yeah.
Like that's psychology, that's biology. Like we just retreat when that doesn't happen. And I think so much of when we look at performance anxiety is, for whatever reason, the clouds around us rise and we stop seeing hope for progress. And it's our job as coaches to show that there is a path and that there is a path towards legitimate progress. And I think this is often where performance anxiety arises in college athletes, because progress in high school often comes straightforward. You know the path, right? Mm-hmm. You go from freshman or JV to varsity, you work your way through varsity, you work your way from the district to leagues to regionals to states to whatever have you. And you see the path towards improvement, and you get thrown into college and you're like, holy crap, everyone is good. I'm working hard, but I'm not moving up. I'm not, sometimes getting better. I'm not making progress. And it's easy at that point to just get in this kind of fear mode where you've spent the last several years dedicating your life to this sport and making it a big part of yourself. And all of a sudden, for the first time, you look left and right and you say, hey, there's no path forward. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, we talked about in a recent podcast about the power of the fifth man and other people and the role they play. This is also part of it in coaching, is if you look at really good teams, they give people paths, right? They show paths for progress. And what that does from top to bottom is it alleviates that burden. It alleviates that feeling like you have no hope, which allows you to try again. And we know this occurs even at the highest level. If you want to see this in a microcosm, go watch the Olympic trials, right? Mm-hmm. And go, especially on the track. What happens way too often when you see a 1500 or a 5K especially, or even in the 10K, when someone who had hope of making the trials, dream fades away, often they go from running whatever a really good pace to just blowing the F up.
Yeah.
And it's not that person went from, oh, I'm doing okay, to, oh, I have nothing left. It's that person who, rightfully so, I'm not blaming them, like they were so focused on top three and this was the dream, this was the goal, and they see it fade away, and that hope, that string of hope of getting there just evaporates, is cut, and you see them just gone. And that's on an individual race level, but our brain does the same thing on a global level. Is if there is no future, there is no path, our brain goes, why in the hell are we putting all this effort towards it? Like, I'm going to do everything possible to make you stop doing this thing, which is often make you feel stressed, anxious, etc., so that you don't try, so that you quit, so that you hit the eject button. And it's our job as coaches to like orient and reframe around that so that they don't just hit the eject button because there is no hope or no path forward.
And that's, I think, that the critical thing is the sport is very objective in the regard that there's a lot of external rankings, external knowns, more so than ever before, right? And you have Mile Split, you have athletic.net, you have TFers, right? You have the A10, whatever in Europe and what have you. You have all these digital spaces that you can go and check where you rank in your rank order, not only locally, but also globally. The problem is that the human psyche isn't meant to deal with the scale of global rankings, right? And now, especially too, in this modern era of the NCAA, where all these deregulations are happening and now NILs or revenue sharing, right? It's changing people's orientation about why they're doing sport, right? It's, oh, I'm doing it to get this money, and how much money am I making, and how do I make this money, and so what are the incentives to make more money? Oh, be more active on social media. And then it spurs this like negative spiral of, are you doing this for a lot of internal reward and benefit, or are you primarily here for the external? And the difficulty, right, is we need external feedback in our world, in our life, to have some internal confidence. Hey, this is why competition and games are useful, because winning feels good. Right? Losing doesn't feel good. And when you win, you get a sense of efficacy, you get a sense of determination, you get a sense of, hey, I am in control of my destiny, right? Master of my destiny. And when you lose, you can also get a sense of, I'm still in control, I did something wrong, how do I get better? And that will spur and motivate you potentially for the next time to meet the demands of the task or demands of the challenge better equipped because you're better prepared. But when we start to think globally right off the rip, and you're like, hey, I started here running 5 minutes for the mile. How the hell am I going to be like a 3:30, 1,500 meter runner overnight? You're not. No one is. It's not going to happen that quickly. It's a long internal journey. And the secret is, right, in a lot of ways, that the people who focus a little bit more on their own journey and the progress in their own steps and ignore the superficial noise, so to speak, of the external drivers or external comparisons, they tend to get a little bit more satisfaction and more intrinsic reward out of the enterprise and activity than people who are solely there for the one-upsmanship, solely there for the notoriety, solely there for the external look at me orientation that can come with achievement in our sport.
Yeah, it's when the external takes over the internal, essentially. It's when the achievement dominates, when the outcome matters more, when we tie our identity to the results more than the process, it backfires, right? And it makes sense because the way it works is our brain, again, goes, it's not, when I line up to race, it's not like just the result that's up to conflict. It's me, myself. You are proving your self-worth. And whenever you put your self-worth on the line, of course your brain and body are going to freak out and be like, oh crap, if we lose, I'm unworthy. I have no self-efficacy, no confidence. I'm useless, etc. And it becomes even exacerbated for people who are pretty good at something, whether it's sport or otherwise, because probably from a young age, you derived a lot of meaning and competency from that sport or activity because that's what you learned to do. So I think that's a large part of the problem. And if we tie it back to what we talked about at the beginning, when we look at social media world, threats everywhere, like part of that is because, quite frankly, we evolved to compete on a local level. It was essentially, for millennia, it was John, Steve, and a tribe of 50 people, including mostly family members or close friends. Who is the best hunter? Who's the best gatherer? Who's the best cook? Among 50, 75 people, you're going to find something you're pretty good at and can contribute to.
Mm-hmm.
If you make that to the whole freaking world, like it feels like on social media, it's a lot harder to feel like, hey, I can contribute, I'm significant, etc. So what do? We default towards why try survival anxious mode. And that's like the world we live in. And as coaches, again, it's really important because yes, like there are simple tools and tricks to like deal with anxiety in the short run of slow down your breathing, try some meditation, listen to some calming music, etc. And those are useful tools to have, but I think on the bigger side is you have to realize the global problem we face ourselves in and provide the security, the path forward, the activity and pursuit where people can try and fail and get back on the horse, the activity or pursuit or environment where we can deal with conflict and disagree and be okay and not feel like we got to run to the referee.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ultimately our job, I think, as coaches more now than ever.
Yeah, and it's an important task in addition to all the other stuff that we are tasked with that you think normally why you got into coaching, right? But I think in this day and age, we have to be sensitive to the reality that we are a line of defense, so to speak, or a line of influence on the mental capacity of the athlete that is a lot more fragile in this day and age because of all the perceptive inputs that are now they're being bombarded with. And again, going back to let's focus on the internal journey and making that an anchor or a pillar of your culture or your coaching practice is really vital, because you have to remember, right, a lot of Olympians who win medals and what have you, or these trinkets, they end up like selling and auctioning them off later in their life. It's because it's not about the things. It's not about the accoutrement. It's not about the reward. While in the short term, in the immediate, that's exciting and you get this big surge of dopamine and that's a good time. But the reality is it's about the doing. It's about the living. It's about the striving. It's about the journey and the exploration. And so, you know, a key thing that I like to do with athletes who have expressed race day anxiety that we can cope with is just focus on the journey and saying, hey, let's meet this challenge in the race that you typically have, and let's try to go and provide another solution to this challenge. So maybe an athlete's a younger athlete and they go out way too fast in the early stages of a 5K, right? And then they end up hanging on for dear life and really decelerate progressively throughout the race. All right, hey, for the first mile, let's be really disciplined and go no faster than this, and then go see what you can do. And then go to explore that space of the last 2 miles of the 5K after you've come to it through this orientation with a slower first mile. Or maybe it's an 800, right? And they don't get out fast enough, or they don't put themselves in their race. And you say, okay, hey, look, get to 600 by this lickety split as fast as you can at this pace objective, right? And then hang on and see what you can do. Because seeing what you can do will then inform me as your coach about where you are not only mentally but also physiologically in terms of acidosis tolerance, general lactate buffering or capacity, right? Pure neuromuscular speed development. All those things I'll be able to get a good pulse on if you put yourself in this situation in the 800. So it's, again, trying to teach people how to race and why to race early on and what are internal drivers for them, and just knowing, hey, look, don't worry about the result. Don't worry about this. It's not that time, right? You're not there yet. It's just getting them to buy into this process and understanding, just like getting a college degree, just like graduating high school, it's a multi-year, multi-step, multifactorial process. And over time, the idea is to create that progress towards this capacity that you want to build, whether it's qualifying the Olympic trials in the marathon, setting this PR, just even sometimes finishing this long of a distance of a race, whatever the challenge may be, is striving towards that to meet that challenge as you can in this space and time with who you are and having that shape who you're going to become, not with, oh, I should be at this standard, I should be here, and if I'm not here at this level, then it's a threat, I suck, what's worth the enterprise? So again, we have to, as coaches, do a really good job of reorienting, and sometimes off the rip, day one, orienting people in the right direction so that we minimize the adverse effects that anxiety and overly threat perspectives can have, and maximize like their development and their journey, that sport can allow them the beauty of maturity and understanding about the human condition.
Couldn't have said it better, John. I think that's a wonderful way to summarize things. We hope that this has provided some insight and a different way to look at kind of the pre-performance stress and anxiety versus the kind of acute short-term things that we're often told to deal with it, because it is, again, it's a problem that research and data shows we're facing more now than ever, especially with teens and young adults. So your job as a coach, I know there's a lot on your plate, but that's the plate of the modern coach.
Yeah, I wish there was like a coaching 101 type thing where this is addressed. Like you get a coaching certification. This should be in that, right? Because again, this is a tough problem, and it's tricky because it's also rapidly evolving and it's rapidly advancing. And yet we don't have necessarily as a profession the skill sets available to us at the degree they're necessary in the moment to meet the demand. And it's just one that, again, through the landscape of the modern world and the digital area, especially that's going to be accelerated with AI, is going to continue to be something that we have to be sensitive to as practitioners working in this space. So this isn't necessarily the end of the discussion, I would say. I'd say this is like the start of it.